Welcome to a special episode of Final Fantasy Weekly. I'm Drew Kreisman.
And I'm Ira Kreisman.
And on this episode, we're going to do something fun. At least we're going to have fun, and we hope you all have fun with it too. We are going to make a theoretical Final Fantasy XVII. Now, to be very clear, this is not what we hope Final Fantasy XVII is. As we've often said, we are very much of the opinion that they should make what they are passionate to make, and then we will enjoy it in our own way and on our own time. But we did sort of start talking to each other on a family vacation recently and getting into some ideas and decide why not just, if we were to make it, if for whatever horrible accident of the universe we were put in charge of the next Final Fantasy game, what would it look like? Well, it would look like this. We're going to talk a bit about the type of gameplay that it would be and the type of world that it would be first, but to give you the overview right up front, it would be a turn-based RPG with tactical elements built around team mechanics in a steampunk 2D hand-drawn art style. So, Ira, let's get into it a little bit. First of all, a lot of this was your idea, I want to say. And you were the first to really bring up this idea of the 2D, HD, 2D thing with the hand-drawn style and maybe simplifying it a bit. Not that we don't love the modern graphics and all of those things, but doing a bit of a throwback.
Yeah, I was really tickled by the 2D sprites everyone got in the bottom right corner when you went into the menu, including Harpocrates got one, and Torgal got one, and whomever was on Clive's team at the moment got one. And I thought that was great. And I kind of thought, if Final Fantasy really wants to do something different for the next game, which they tend to want to do, going back to a 2D style would really throw people for a loop. And so I just love the idea of a huge cast and 2D sprites. And I don't know if I want to go so far as to say MIDI sound, but really, if everyone's going to be doing remakes and retreads, how about we do a demake, as it were?
Yeah. And I really like the idea, too, of taking advantage of whatever modern technology this would be on. Just assume modern consoles, right? And doing updos in graphics in terms of, you know, the effects. And like we've seen in games like Octopath Traveler or the Pixel remasters or Live I Live. But I would also be very interested in, like I mentioned, the kind of hand-drawn art style. Maybe something that's not quite so pixelated so that it feels and looks in a lot of ways like a throwback, but you could do something a little more akin to a few other games that we're going to talk about from a gameplay standpoint here in a minute. But there are a lot more of these sort of hand-drawn style or anime style games that I'd like to see. I think Final Fantasy could do that really, really well.
What was that game that you were showing me where the young woman becomes the hero and she like collects other heroes in her mind space, which reminded me a lot of one of the conceits of one of my books, having a space in one's mind that one can manipulate and build.
Yeah, that's exactly the game I was just thinking of. It's called Indivisible. And yeah, when she goes to the place in her mind, I was like, oh, it's like Ira's book.
That sort of 2D hand-drawn kind of style, I think, is beautiful.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm imagining. I mentioned a steampunk world. We've talked a lot about, we both got into the series with 6, and steampunk is a type of thing I like a lot, and a lot of Final Fantasy games toy in it, 9 and 12, and even 16 at times, but 6 is really the only one that at its baseline is set in a steampunk world, but I wouldn't necessarily go, you know, old Victorian or old American West. Like, you can do futuristic steampunk, so I'm not sold on one era or the other. I just want a lot of practical steampunk style, you know, gears and mechanics and all of that stuff. I love it when Final Fantasy incorporates it, and I think it's time for another one to have that at the forefront.
One of the things about steampunk is the punk part of it is very important because we tend to be fighting against a modernization that will take away from everybody being able to build their own car to, well, no, you've got to buy from us.
Right.
And steam power tends to be, at least in stories, it's going to be the clean power. But oh no, we've got this brand new fuel that we've cooked up. It's the life stream, or, you know, we mined the mother crystal or what have you.
So inside of this big, beautiful, maybe watercolory steampunk world, I mentioned the hand-drawn. I like the idea of perhaps an homage to some of those early Amano sketches that we've talked about being more ephemeral or ethereal or whatever those words are. And so, misty. Right, a misty. And another homage to early games, and I think another good reason, if we want to be practical about why are we paring down some of the visuals a little bit, a huge cast.
Yes.
This is something you and I have wanted in Final Fantasy for a while. I know it's your big thing, so give it to me. Why a big, huge cast?
Because I like it.
Right. Okay, how a huge, big cast then? How?
Right. Yeah. Like you talked about, Final Fantasy VI was big for us. I loved Shining Force and Suikoden and some of those games where you've got these giant casts, and most of them, some of them, a lot of them are playable. They're playable on the battlefield. And one of my favorite parts of Final Fantasy VI was the Phoenix Cave or Kefka's Tower, where you've got 3 groups of 4, so that's almost the entire party. So I was thinking, what if you could do like 5 groups of 5 or 6 groups of 5 or something along those lines, where I could suddenly justify 30 main characters, 30 characters who all get their own stories, their own arcs, their own chapters, and who, when you're doing the big dungeons, you get to take everybody.
Yeah.
And so that's what I want. I don't know how the math would work out precisely, and I'm sure building that and balancing that would make it exhausting for programmers.
Oh yeah, this thing that we're designing, and when we get to the gameplay, it's just going to be an absolute nightmare for the developers. But that's a tomorrow problem, as they say in the business.
Another thing I really enjoy is when the heroes are a team of Avengers and the bad guys are Thanos.
Right.
The heroes are a group, a team, a family, and the bad guy is the fascist overlord and his 3 or 4 underlings. Because I think that really exemplifies this idea that we are stronger together, that we don't do it on our own. Even if it seems like you're doing it on your own, you got your friends' voices in your head. Ray is the only person I'm referring to there, right? So that's another... So that thematic element, as well as being able to take everybody on the adventure and have a big old party of folks who are just pals and friends and brothers and sisters and siblings and all the rest of it. I want it. I love it. If I were in charge of Final Fantasy XVII, that would be top of my list.
And maybe no main character also, something that Final Fantasy VI did really well and something we've talked about before. And there are more gameplay elements to that, but we'll get to the gameplay in just a second. Few more points on the story and world. Probably not a huge surprise from us, but we talked about we would want this to be a pretty linear story with minimal side content, not that dissimilar from 16. I know a lot of people didn't love that about it, but if we're going to implement all of these gameplay systems we're going to talk about in a minute and have a huge cast and all of these other things, I don't think we're going to have much time for dungeon crawling and gear manufacturing, though there are going to be some parts of that again, I want to talk about in a minute because there's a gameplay element that I really want. And then this is something that we're just going to mention that I don't think we have an answer for, but we've got to come up with a twist. We don't know what the story is at all, but we need to know, are there robots in this? Are we going to go to space? Before we've written a thing at all, what's most important is, is it all a dream? Is there time travel? Is there an alternate dimension? What is that thing? Right? There's obviously going to be robots in this thing. That's a given. But, if we got 50 characters, at least one of them's going to be a robot. One of them's going to be an alien. That's just the law of big numbers in a fantasy RPG. But... so let's get into then the gameplay system that we have designed. And I have no idea to what extent this is possible, but here's what we thought of. Essentially, as Ira talked about, if we're going to have a huge cast in this game, the way I'm imagining this is picture a Final Fantasy Tactics type of game where your character that moves around the screen is actually the captain of a regiment. Right? Or a unit of 5 or 4 characters. Again, this is up to the developers to see if it's even possible. But you would move your characters around a large battlefield. So the story would be built around large-scale battles. Again, Ira mentioned Suikoden earlier. And similarly, I would want these huge battles, but with the small skirmishes in between, so that when you match up with somebody else on the battlefield, again, anyone who's played Fire Emblem might be familiar with the way it kind of goes into a different screen, and you're now on like a 2D battlefield that looks similar to a JRPG, but in this system, you would then now just control it, a la Final Fantasies 1 through 9 or 10, right? Those kinds of more classic turn-based RPGs, but you'd be moving around on the battlefield and doing a lot of other things tactically from the main, like, chessboard style. Yeah?
So if we're doing 30, 6 by 5 is 30, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you've got 6 figures on the battlefield, but each of them represents a group of 5.
Right.
And so now you've got 30 people on your battlefield. That's super cool. And maybe you don't have to have full parties, right? So maybe you could have some that are 3 and some that are 2 if you don't have enough, if you don't have all the characters yet.
Right.
But yeah, I love that idea. And then when you encounter a bad guy or an enemy or whatever, suddenly you're in a turn-based, maybe ATB, Final Fantasy style fight. That's great. I love it.
Another key thing to this is I would want to have a bunch of team attacks a la Chrono Trigger, and a lot of like team attributes, right? That building your units. If a group of 5 sticks together throughout more and more battles, they would grow together. You would, of course, have things. I think of Valkyria Chronicles has systems like this where, different characters, they'll grow in their relationship, both in the story, which it presents all kinds of great possibilities. Again, challenge for the writers to write a bunch of different potential interactions between anywhere from 30 to 60 to 90 characters. If I'm going full Suikoden, they had 100.
Right, yeah.
Which, again, this is something else that I would want to have, because in addition to having all of these character relationships and attributes and team attacks and I want it to all essentially be built around this concept from a gameplay standpoint. What are your parties? Who are you making friends? What units work well together and all of that stuff. And then the other big system that I want in here, a city builder.
Yes.
A town builder.
Oh, man.
Build your castle up, again, like Suikoden. And this allows you to build out your cast of characters with not everybody needing to be a badass elf or an orc with an axe. Some people can just be chefs and builders and botanists and tool makers, and they won't be nearly as useful in battle, but they'll give you certain buffs and benefits for your gear and your items and for building up your town and things like that.
So you talked about not having a lot of extra stuff, not a lot of mini games and whatnot. But if we're going to have a town, if we're going to have our hideaway to build up, one of the things you could do is have all the mini games and whatnot be in the town, be as you're building up your town. Now suddenly we're playing Harvest Moon.
Right. I think that should be the extent of the mini games, right? Yeah, it should all be the only mini games that should exist should be about farming and hey, we can bring back fishing, sure, but they don't have a purpose here. But yeah, you're basically right. Like we've got a tactical turn-based RPG whenever we're going to war, and Harvest Moon at home.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. I like that a lot. So now we're going beyond that 30, right? We're inching up to that 100 you were talking about. Because you might not be controlling the warriors when you're at home. Maybe now you are controlling the chef or the farmer.
Sure.
Or excuse me, the botanist and the culinarian and the
right.
And all the other disciples of the hand, the disciples of the land.
Right.
I think that's great.
And you can even use that terminology to keep it, Final Fantasy on brand or whatever. But I even think of Final Fantasy 16 and all of the incredible, wonderful characters that we met who, you wouldn't necessarily take into battle. And again, for those of you that haven't played Suikoden, it balances this out really well. And there's a way you put if you're out in field of battle and you're attacked, you put the chefs and the botanists in the back, but they help during the battle by, cooking food and making medicines and all the things. So I think there's a way to incorporate those type of people, the Marthas and so on of the world, not just as really great characters that we love, but also have them be technically party members if we're going to have 100 party members, right?
Right. There could be a support role slot.
Yes.
That's not on the battlefield, but if you're within range of whatever, you can eat the jerky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dealfield Chronicles does that, where there's a support slot where, one of them isn't even fighting. It's like Squires in battle, right? And again, there's real world parallels you can make. So I just think, that way you could create a really focused, tight, like gameplay loop between going out on the campaigns and fighting against. Clearly, this is going to be a Rebels versus Empire story with lots of large, Final Fantasy Tactics style, big scale battles with all of these characters. And then you go out, you do all that, and then you come back to the city, and whoever you've rescued from battle, or you could even do it so that there are systems like there are in Tactics or whatever, where there's almost a character generator thing, right? So that everyone in your town can be somebody that you've saved from the Empire, or people you've taken prisoner. Like, it obviously, we're getting really complicated here, but I really think there's a super cool concept to be worked on where you do fight those big scale battles, and then you go back and you build up your stronghold, and
Okay, so
yes,
I kind of want 30 some Final Fantasy type characters, but I also like the idea of recruiting after combat or whatever, and having maybe a bunch of soldiery type guys too. Didn't Suikoden have large, not just character to character battles, but like army to army battles? So something that's really big in the news, in the nerd zeitgeist right now, is Baldur's Gate 3.
Right.
And one of the reasons is it's got one of the best character builder engines ever.
Yeah.
And I remember my favorite part of those old WWE games where you get to build your own fighter.
Yeah.
Was just so many options for building a character. And so maybe one of the things that could be incorporated is to fill out to the 100 is every once in a while you're given the opportunity, a character from the Empire arrives, a defector.
Yeah.
And they, as we have pointed out, are covered head to toe. They got a mask.
Right.
They got a helmet. We don't know their name. Maybe they don't have a name. They've got a number. Right?
Right.
It's Finn all over again.
Right. The Empire
They
numbers.
take their helmet off. Yeah, and now you get to choose all of it. Name, gender, all sorts of coloration and ethnicity, and damn near anything you want.
Right.
And then you spend the next, if it's me, 3.5 hours
creating a character,
designing this one character.
Yeah.
Who will be part of the army or whatever. Yeah, and maybe all they really want to do is be actually an artist, and that gives you a benefit somehow.
Right.
Or whatever.
Right. And we even talked about how, Final Fantasy II had so many incredible systems that it never got to fully realize. And you mentioned the WWE games. MLB The Show does stuff like this too, where it's like the way you build up your character, they essentially have a stat for every tiny little possible thing the guy can do, for every pitch that he throws, for every, there's so many different things, and you could basically do that. Just create a whole series of stats for all different kinds of things, and that each character would get better in the old Final Fantasy II method by doing it, by whatever they did. So you have your cook, they get better at it. But if you take your cook into battle often enough, they can get better at that too, right? And so those are the kinds of things I would love, that kind of hyper stylized and customizable system, all with a really linear story about the Rebels versus the Empire at the heart of it.
So to that end, another thing I would want to include is all of the systems, or at least a reference to all of the systems. So you've got some characters who might switch between very specific classes, but then you might have characters who, like you're talking about, can do anything, and so whichever things you have them do are the things they get good at. Right. So now we've got 1 and 2, and also kind of 3 and 5 and Tactics and 10 too.
Right.
But also maybe there's Materia or Magicite or something that is kind of both of them.
Right.
So maybe you've got some characters who
they're Materia
can use
users.
Magicite.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And some can draw and junction.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe some paradigm somehow.
Right.
And then function based upon that.
And only a handful of summoners. I love it when summoners are rare. In fact, one of my favorite Final Fantasy tropes is there's only one summoner, or like 16, I guess, kind of did a fun thing where it was like, it's these people and nobody else. Right. I like that. And I could see building part of the story around that as well. If you've got all these jobs and all these people that can do things, having one that really stands out, and once again, building the story around the epic, awesome monsters that we all love. I'm going to do that too. So what we have here is
is a mess.
An absolute
Sorry,
mess. Suikoden meets Fire Emblem, meets Dark Cloud, meets Final Fantasy Tactics, meets traditional Final Fantasy, done in a watercolor steampunk Yoshitaka Amano inspired style
Of Harvest Moon.
of Harvest Moon.
A little bit of Gold Saucer, maybe, I don't know. But we have sort of put out a lot of ideas, some of which might be kind of contradictory. What would be one, maybe two things that would be your non-negotiables for this game were we to be put in charge?
I want the town builder. I really like the idea of bringing that genre of game into Final Fantasy a bit more. So yeah, I want that. What about you?
The large cast,
Yeah.
each of whom gets a chapter or an arc of some kind.
Boom. So there you have it. That's Final Fantasy 17. If we were to make it, the beginnings of it. We haven't written a story or anything. But RPG Maker exists. And so if you guys like that, no, there's no way for us to combine all those systems in an RPG Maker. But if you're a developer and you've got a lot of extra free time and cash, just subscribe to the Patreon page. Patreon.com/FFweekly. All right, get the hell out of here. Stop recording.